Greetings. This video is going to tell you all about the US Constitution for Edexcel US Politics. It's going to tell you what a constitution is, what the features of the US Constitution is, as well as defining a load of key terms and giving you some examples for you to understand for your A-level. So let's crack on by looking at where you can get some further information about the Constitution. You should be able to look at both of your textbooks, both your revision guide and your main one, and there's lots of other resources you can use as well, other videos. Ask your teacher where you can look, because you need to have a really good understanding of this, because so much of American politics is based around this idea of a constitution. So what is a constitution? What would the features of a constitution be? First of all, a constitution just in any country determines how political power should be distributed. So what is the power of the president or the prime minister or the legislature or the judiciary? A constitution specifies exactly who can do what and whose responsibility that is. It establishes the, oh, my voice just broke. It establishes the relationships between those different branches. Think checks and balances in the UK, but it often it often explains how one branch might be able to remove another, e.g. impeaching a president, for example. It talks about the limits of government power. Think liberalism and good old John Locke. It talks about what government can do and what government can't do. Think Magna Carta back for King John in British history. The limits of governmental power to prevent dictatorship and tyranny. And so much of American history is about preventing tyranny, preventing one individual or one group from holding so much power that effectively you get back to a monarchy. Remember, the US Revolution in many ways was to get independence from the UK, and therefore the Constitution is very, very keen that you should never get a situation where someone is able to dictate instructions to someone else. And there's this huge push towards liberty and personal freedom, which is still very much in present today. Constitutions often explore the rights of their citizens, and this was done through constitutional amendments. The original Constitution doesn't actually contain the Bill of Rights. It was added as they agreed that they would add the Bill of Rights, and it was added over the next few years, and most constitutions contain them. It often contains practical things such as who is an American citizen, or who is a British citizen, or who is a Belgian citizen, and who isn't, who can claim to be part of this country and not. I clearly need to put these things on the other side of the page. And a constitution will also specify, if it's well written, how you can amend a constitution as well. So here is the document. What is the process for changing this document? Because if a constitution is well written, the people that write it will understand that they've got it right for now, they think, but it will need to be changed over time. And of course, you might want to add other words like codified and entrenched, but not all constitutions will contain all of these things, and not all constitutions will be codified, and not all constitutions will be entrenched. But this is the kind of the generality of what you might expect to see in the Constitution, and what you do see in the American Constitution. Now, I've already kind of referred to the history that is connected to the American Constitution. The idea of freedom and getting away from tyranny and things like that. But you can also see within the Constitution the battles that were taking place at the time between the different groups of the early Americans and the Founding Fathers. The first big debate that you should be aware of is the debate between Federalists and non-Federalists. There was a large group of people that wanted all of the American states to come together and be one giant country. There was also a large group of people that wanted each state to be more or less its own country. Remember, there was that big experiment, the confederal states, where they wanted a very, very loose national government. It didn't work. So this was kind of round two. And what they're trying to do here is they're trying to make both groups happy. They're trying to create a federal government, a national government, but also give powers to the individual states. And you'll see that battle throughout the Constitution. There's also a debate here between large and small states. The large states obviously far geographically bigger, but also population-wise they're bigger. And the small states were worried that they were going to be kind of swallowed up or kind of taken over or always be kind of outvoted. Now, and lastly, there was a debate between the appointed president and an elected president. Like, how are we going to make this figurehead? Are we even going to have one president, or are we going to have a kind of a group executive? And how is that going to come about? Are we going to give the power to the people to change it, to choose their president, or is it going to be appointed by the people who know best? That kind of things. Now think, how are these compromises seen in the Constitution? What have you read so far? What have you kind of come across? Well, Federalist versus non-Federalist is seen in the first few clauses. It talks about which powers are specifically for the federal government and which powers are specifically for the states. Large versus small states, you can see that in the powers of, you can see that in Congress. The House of Representatives is set up by having is based on population. So a state with higher population will have more representatives, but in the Senate, every state has exactly the same amount too, regardless of the size. And appointed versus elected president, well, this was done through the Electoral College, which over time, the Electoral College came to be elected, and the Electoral College then kind of appoints president. So you can see those kind of compromises there. So the history is behind so much of the Constitution. So what is actually in it? Now, the Constitution contains various articles, a bit like a kind of a magazine in some way. And an article is not one paragraph. An article is a big section of several kind of paragraphs. And some of these articles are longer than others, and we're going to be looking at, I think, 7 here. And the first one is all about the legislature, which perhaps does imply, similar to the UK Constitution, that there is a supremacy or a sovereignty of the legislature, which is higher than the others. It is the first thing to be defined. And so what does it, I'm not going to do this with every clause, but what does it say about the legislature? Well, it tells you what it is, how it's appointed, how it's elected, how it can be removed, who can be in it, how old they have to be, some of the specific powers that they have, and some of the specific powers that they don't have, etc., etc. It's probably worth you grabbing a copy of the textbook, which does actually have some of the articles in it, and maybe just reading through a section or two and trying to understand the kind of things that are explained there. No surprise, Article 2 is then going to be the executive, similar thing. So Article 3 is going to be, it's going to be the judiciary, again specifying what their role is and what their powers are. And remember, these powers have kind of changed over time. So an interesting question, which we might look at later, would be something along the lines of, to what extent does the judiciary fulfill the role that it was originally envisioned to be, and how much has it grown? Same with the executive. So the executive, the president, has definitely become more powerful over time than was originally envisioned by this document, and perhaps the legislature then has had to go the other way. So there is a difference between what is written and perhaps what has actually happened in political reality. Article 4, state-federal relationships. What does the national government do? What does the state government do? Remember, in a federal system, in theory, the two groups are equal in many, many ways. They work alongside each other. It's not like devolution in the UK, where you've got a national government which is clearly above the devolved government. In a federal system, they're different. Their roles and responsibilities are different, but in theory, they are equal because their powers are set out clearly in a constitution. Article 5 deals with the amendment process. How is the Constitution going to be changed? Whose permission do you need? And we'll cover that more in the next video. And there's also this thing called a supremacy clause, which says that anything in the Constitution and anything in the federal laws actually does overrule the state law. So I've just said that in the federal system, you've kind of got this system of evenness, but there is this controversial supremacy clause that says if there's a law by the federal government, then that does overrule the state government, which means any federal law can be very controversial. And that's often where you end up in the judiciary and in the Supreme Court saying, well, can the federal government do that? Because the supremacy clause says that the Constitution and treaties and federal laws are the supreme law of the land, higher than the states. And lastly, ratification. Ratification is a term which means where you agree a treaty. So say, for example, I propose a new law about homework. I proposed it, and then the class or the school would then ratify it. They'd vote for it, they'd vote against it, they'd debate it. So the Constitution was proposed by the Founding Fathers, and then it had to be ratified by all of the remaining states. They had to go and they had to agree to it, and it took a long time. The Constitution wasn't just like they looked at it and went, "Great, I love this Constitution, let's go have it." It took years for every state to actually sign up and ratify the Constitution before the United States of America really did become the United States of America. So what are the key features of the US Constitution? I hope, by the way, you're pausing this video whenever you need to and taking notes and expanding where you need to. The whole idea is that you can rewind, you can replay, you can do whatever it is you need to do. So the key features of the US Constitution that we are going to be discussing, and by features I don't necessarily mean what's in it, I mean kind of like from a descriptive point of view. First of all, it is codified. Secondly, it is specific and it's vague, and so I put a blurry picture there for that kind of the vagueness, and it is entrenched, and there's a picture of a kind of a World War I trench. Now hopefully you know what these terms mean already, especially if you remember from your UK politics, so it might be worth you pausing the video and just having a little think, like what do these mean, checking your own understanding before I kind of develop these ideas further. So what does it mean? So the US Constitution is codified. This means that it is written physically in one document. It's found in one place. It's not like the UK one where you've got a bit in convention, you've got a bit in statute law, you've got a bit in authoritative text, you've got a bit in kind of common judicial law. The US Constitution is in one document, which is actually pretty short, and therefore it's codified in a way that the UK one isn't. It was also created at one time. Now, this one isn't necessarily necessary, but nearly all countries with codified constitutions, this is what it has happened. The group got together either at the beginning of the country or after some sort of kind of revolution, and together they wrote down this constitution. Now, all constitutions will have amendments as well. So the original constitution is made in, say, 1950, and then you get amendments in 1955, and then more in 1960, and more in 2019. So, but the original document is created at one time and then kind of developed on from there. And lastly, a codified constitution is separate from all other laws. Now, this, you could use the word entrenched here to describe this, which is why I've got that picture there. But what I mean is there is a clear distinction between constitutional laws, which is like the powers of the president, and other laws, like the law on abortion, like the law on taxes or something like that. But although taxes actually appears in both. But my point is that these laws that describe how a country is run are separate from the laws that actually kind of govern that country, or what people have to do or not do. And in most cases, that means they are entrenched as well. So that's a codified constitution. Now just think to your own understanding then, so what does codified mean, and how is that different from UK and US? Now, also think further here, what is the impact of that? What is the impact of America having a codified constitution and the UK having an uncodified constitution? And then what are the advantages and the disadvantages of that? Be a lovely question to come up in the exam. Could come up as a 12 marker, maybe even a 30 marker, some sort of debate about codification or not. It is deliberately specific and vague. What does specific and vague mean? Well, vague is when things are kind of just general and don't really go into too much detail, and they doesn't really kind of have pinpoint knowledge, a bit like your essays at the beginning of the course. And specific is when something is absolutely accurate and knows lots of things, and it tells you exactly what it does and so on, just like your essays will be at the end of the course, or something like that. So what is specific in the US Constitution and what is vague? First of all, the Supremacy Clause. I mentioned that one earlier. The Constitution says that the Constitution is supreme, which is very, very humble of it. It states that the Constitution, as well as treaties and federal laws, shall be the supreme law of the land. So that's pretty specific. This Constitution is it. This is this is where real power lies. The Constitution also contains specific enumerated powers. Now, I've got a little picture of kind of Washington, D.C. there. An enumerated power is the powers which are delegated to the federal government. And remember, the federal government is the president, and it's the Supreme Court, and it's the legislature. All of those together are the federal government, the national government. And the enumerated powers are the ones which they specifically have, and that's in the first 3 articles of the Constitution. It's going to be things like declare war, it's going to be things like print money or coin money. I would suggest you Google the phrase enumerated powers and some of the other phrases later, and you kind of get yourself a little list, so you kind of get an understanding of which powers kind of go where within the Constitution. There's also this thing, if the enumerated powers are the specific ones, then the implied powers are the vague ones. An implied power is this. So the Constitution says that the government, the federal government, has the power to raise an army and a navy. Well, so what do you need to be able to do to raise an army and a navy? Well, then you need to be able to recruit people to that army and navy. You need to be able to raise taxes to pay for that army and navy. So those powers aren't necessarily explicit and enumerated power, they are implied. So although there are things that the Constitution doesn't say that the federal government can do, realistically the federal government has to do them, otherwise they wouldn't be able to do the enumerated powers. So there's and then of course there can be a debate about an implied power. So do they have the power to raise taxes to build a wall or not? Think kind of trumpet, you know, you can go kind of that way. Then there's this mysterious elastic clause, which is in Article 1, Section 8. I'm just checking my information here. It's also sometimes known as the necessary and proper clause. And what it says that Congress has, and I'll read it out, it has the powers to make all laws necessary and proper to carry out the federal government's duties. Federal government has the power to make all laws necessary and proper to carry out the federal government's duties. And this has become known as the elastic clause, because what it's effectively saying is that the government has the power to make any laws that is necessary for it to fulfill what it needs to do. Now that kind of stretches and stretches and stretches. So if we need the power to defend the country, then we need to be able to make soldiers, and then therefore we need to be able to get land to put our army bases on, and therefore we need to be able to get more money to pay for these, and therefore we need to be able to do relations with foreign powers, etc., etc. And you see, so this necessary and proper thing can be used to justify hoovering up more and more powers. And this can be seen particularly when you get to things like Roosevelt's New Deal, or maybe when you kind of get more kind of left-wing governments that want to try and do things in terms of kind of healthcare and things like that. And so when it says that, so some people will argue that the federal government needs to be able to add on these extra powers to do what is necessary and proper to carry out the federal government's duties. And I really need a drink. So the elastic clause is controversial. Might be worth you Googling it, have a bit of research, what has been used under the elastic clause to try and increase the powers of the federal government. But then, going the other way, going away from enumerated, implied, and the elastic clause, there is magical 10th Amendment, the reserve powers. This is where the states fight back against the empire. This is the powers that are not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to the states, are reserved to the states respectively. Or to put it in very simple language, basically anything that the Constitution doesn't say is an enumerated power belongs to the states. I'll say that again. So if the Constitution doesn't specifically say this is the power of the president or this is the power of the Congress, it belongs to the states. And this is where, of course, implied powers and the elastic clause can come into conflict with the reserve powers, because if it isn't an enumerated power, in theory, it belongs to the state, the individual states like Texas, like California. So you can understand why individual states might want to argue very passionately that certain powers are not implied or aren't under the elastic clause, which is when you start to get to things like gun laws, abortion laws, etc., etc. And people could be on both, different states can be on different sides of that argument. So there might be some liberal states that might want to ban guns, but actually the Supreme Court says, no, that's actually an enumerated power because it's in one of the constitutional amendments. You might get some states that say, we really want to ban abortion, but actually abortion has been taken as a federal power through the elastic clause and saying, well, it's necessary. And you get where I'm kind of going with this? So this is where the 10th Amendment. So try and remember that 10 as well. Get an extra mark in the exam by saying it's the 10th Amendment, the important one, the reserve powers. And then lastly, there are a few which are concurrent powers, meaning things that both the federal and state governments can do. And this tends to be very practical things such as elements of taxation, building roads, having courts, etc., etc. These are kind of the least controversial ones in many ways, but there are some things that obviously both sides have to be able to do. Might be worth you pausing here, having a little Google around some of these different kind of aspects, finding out which power is going to go where, maybe testing yourself a little bit on this, because this is quite a complex idea, but it's important that you have a good handle on it. And lastly, the US Constitution is entrenched in a way that the UK one just absolutely isn't. Entrenched means, as hopefully you know, it makes a constitution very difficult to remove or to change or to abolish, but there is a system by which it can be done, which is known as the amendment process, and it's designed to be deliberately difficult. And in the next video, we're going to go through the amendment process, and we're going to talk about how it can happen and which ones have happened and which ones have worked, and we can kind of evaluate that process. But just think about the US and the UK here. In the UK, if they want to change the constitution, you just make a law. You need a simple majority in the House of Commons, and then the House of Lords approves it. But in the US, it's far more complicated. You need far bigger majorities in Congress, and you also then need to get the approval of the individual states as well. This takes far more time, it takes far more effort, and there needs to be an overwhelming desire for change in a way that you don't necessarily need. So I hope that was useful. Make sure you've got some good notes. You should find there's some other activities for you to complete alongside this video, and make sure and ask me if you've got any questions. Thank you. If I've made any mistakes, then do put them in the comments on the video, or if there's any useful examples or links that would be helpful, then also stick them in the comment section as well. And if you like the video, don't forget to like it. See ya.